0845 6060 973.
9 minutes before 8, let's catch up with the latest situation in the Ukraine and turn straight to Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who joins me now. We're hearing from the Ukrainian president the next 24 hours are crucial. If the British services and the British government recognise that, why? Why are the next 24 hours so key? Secretary of State, good morning.
Good morning. Well, the Russians have still failed to take a number of their key objectives. The two big cities up in the northeast of the country, actually quite close to the Russian border, have put up not only a good resistance, they've actually repelled the Russians in a number of cases. They also, to the northwest of Kyiv, is about 30 kilometres to the northwest, is the big armoured column that has been shown on the media to some extent, and they're all in a sort of line waiting to try and go forward. They have slowed because of, again, strong Ukrainian resistance. Obviously, the tactic of the Russians is to try and encircle Kiev and effectively dismember the government. So far, they've failed in a number of those areas. Their advanced forces, the sort of unconventional forces that we've seen people being mopped up around the city, didn't get there. They didn't get that airfield that they wanted, which they'd clearly planned to fly in loads of sort of paratroopers and everything else to then invade. So that's why they're all slowed down. But, of course, if they break through and they start to surround Kiev, then, of course, you get to a position that, you have to move to another phase. It isn't over. And I think what people should look at, if you look at the map of Ukraine, it's the size of Germany and France put together. They haven't even gone near the west of the country yet. They've only focused on their own border cities, which they haven't managed to take. They have a bit more success down in Crimea. They broke out of Crimea and are heading, fun enough, back towards Russia to the sort of breakaway republics and those two cities there. They have had some success there. But fundamentally, what they are clearly trying to do is encircle Kiev. And at the moment, they haven't been successful. They are taking casualties on a daily basis. They are a little in chaos in some areas. Their logistics supply chains are slowing. One of the reasons we've seen Belarus decide to enter, in some sense, the conflict is because I think of that pressure. And I don't know if you saw the footage of the sort of powwow with President Putin and his defense counterpart, Mr. Shoigu, and you'd have to, and General Grazimov, you'd have to have a pair of binoculars to see them because they were so far down the end of the table. But even then, you could see that the body language wasn't as confident as it had been. And I think that is somebody was going to have to give them the news that it wasn't full of excited Ukrainians waiting to be liberated by a generous Russia. And I think that is what they based most of their plans on.
As you've watched developments over the weekend, companies such as BP deciding to get out of Russia, football clubs taking various decisions, sporting bodies taking various decisions, the financial world turning against, and also EU blocking Russia today. What's gone through your mind about the actions that have been taken?
Well, I think it sends an incredibly strong message, and look, this is really important. That, first of all, we recognise this is not about Russian people, right? A lot of these poor Russian people are being thrown into the front line by a government that has little regard for them and a president that is pursuing some legacy, glorious legacy. And there are plenty of law-abiding, often very poor Russians, both in their own country, and there are many Russians who have left their country and are now living in Britain and Europe because they disagree with the Putin regime. And I think that is, first of all, we have to make sure that the actions we are taking, people understand, these are aimed at the Russian government. They are there to isolate the Russian government, to say to President Putin, this course of action will leave you isolated and contained on the world stage. And you currently draw wealth from your banks, which is why we're freezing assets. You currently like to play on the world stage at international sporting events. And, if you can't be, as we'd say, the big I am, you're not really much of a glamorous leader if you can't really go anywhere. And I think that's all really important to feed into the Russian government's psyche and to some extent put pressure into Russia to remind the people that their suffering is because of the Russian leadership's behaviour. But we don't want them to suffer, and we don't want this to be about Russian people. It's fundamentally about the government and the Kremlin.
When we spoke last week, I referenced a caller who had a daughter who was very worried about the world moving to the brink of war. And you mentioned, I think, one of your own family, your 12-year-old son. What are you telling him about the possibility of a nuclear war, were he to ask you that, Defence Secretary?
He did ask me that. He asked me that yesterday because, it's all over the news. So I think...
Well, he's also he's seeing Dad work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
Yeah, well,
obviously, he's worried a bit about Dad. So when your son says Dad, are we going to have a nuclear war? Never mind Ben Wallace, what does Dad say to his boy?
Well, Dad says, no, we're not going to have a nuclear war. What I've said to him is, look, President Putin is dealing at the moment in a rhetoric. He wants to distract from what's gone wrong in Ukraine, and he wants us all to be reminded that he has a nuclear deterrent. And then, actually, we get into a discussion that I, of my age, remember in the 1980s, which is, we've all forgotten all those nuclear debates that we all probably had. You're about younger than me, but you'll remember them as well.
I am. I think it's quite considerably the other way around, but do go on.
That's a bit of misinformation operations there.
Yeah, you old flatterer. On you go, sir.
is that we've all got out of the habit. Britain has a nuclear deterrent. It's somewhere out there under the sea, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's kept us safe for decades. It is a deterrent by definition and design, and President Putin knows that. And he knows that America and France also have a deterrent. So I think this is, we analysed what he said. We've looked at their posture. There isn't a significant change. This is more about, I think, putting putting it on the table to flex muscles and detract. But it's also to say to those people listening to this programme is that, no one is going to do anything to unnecessarily provoke him or indeed to escalate this beyond trying to deter him from his actions in Ukraine. And we know that he gets deterred by might. Military might makes a difference. What the Germans announced yesterday is the very opposite of what he wants. We told him that. We warned him that. I warned them in Moscow myself a couple of weeks ago that I said, look, we can go through the sort of shadow dancing of you said this, I said this. But I said, I know the Europeans, I know the West, and what we will do is you'll get more NATO forces, more defence spending, which is exactly what you don't want. And sure enough, it's what happened in 2014, and it's what's about to happen now.
Just a couple of last points, Secretary of State. Dan in Kent says, I'm a military man. Does the Defence Secretary think it's a good idea, as Liz Truss does, that untrained civilians go and fight in Ukraine? You were a captain in the Scots Guards. You're decorated. You were mentioned in dispatches. Would you want untrained civilians effectively in the trenches alongside you?
Well, first of all, I don't think Liz Truss talked about untrained civilians. I think she asked if it was a cause worth fighting for.
Should Britons go to the Ukraine? So I'm going to say that some of those Britons would be untrained. So my question comes back to you, Captain. Would you want untrained blokes and women alongside you?
Untrained blokes. Well, first of all, let's remember, untrained people in Ukraine are fighting the Russian army, and some of them successful. There are men and women joining up in bravery and making a difference. Some of the heroic battles have been partly because the Russians cannot understand, funnily enough, that people don't like their country invaded. So they have a role. But no, my advice to Britons listening to this is, look, there are lots of ways to help the Ukrainian fight. First and foremost, you can donate to the Ukrainian embassy, and they use that money to purchase lethal and non-lethal aid to help, and other areas, whether it's medicines or humanitarian. That's the first way you can help. The second way, if you want to help in voluntary organisations dealing with refugees or anything else, they're all out there. If you want to join our armed forces, they're some of the best armed forces in the world. Our reforms we're putting in will make sure you have a brilliant career and excellent kit. You can do that, make a difference. We have armed forces right now in places like Poland and Estonia making the case for deterrence and helping indirectly, effectively, Ukraine. We have those people on those submarines that I talked about out there somewhere keeping us safe. So there are lots of ways of doing it. If you are really determined to go, you will be breaking Foreign Office travel advice. But if you are determined to go, my advice is be trained, be someone who has an experience in the armed forces. Don't be a serving member of the armed forces because you'll be deserting. Yes. But be a trained person because it is very dangerous, and I don't want to see British people killed any more than I want to see Ukrainians.
OK, so were you not otherwise engaged? Would you go, Secretary of State?
No, I wouldn't go at the moment. I would always fight for my country. I would stand in line. I'd probably be reduced by now to being charged at my age of the Home Guard or something if it happened that way. There's a phrase in the armed forces and in intelligence circles which is when you're out of date. I'm not quite sure I'd make my fitness test. But look, I think in my mind I'd be always willing to fight. I contribute by being Defence Secretary I've always believed in standing up to bullies and protecting those people that can't protect themselves. I have the greatest satisfaction as Defence Secretary of being able to do that for people in Ukraine right now. And I will go from this studio to a Cobra to plan what next steps we can do.
Grateful for your time as ever. Thank you. Secretary of State Ben Wallace appearing here on LBC at 2 minutes after 8. Let's set the news. Next to Holly Harris.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom.